Hi everyone, and welcome to the next episode of People Matter. This one is going to be looking at the government's intention to introduce legislation to cap non-competition restrictive covenants at 3 months. If we want to understand why the government has introduced it, we need to go back to 2020 because the government started a consultation about reforms in the area of restrictive covenants. Essentially, what it was looking at is ways to enable greater movement within the labour market, which is a massive challenge at the moment, but also to encourage competition. And the thought essentially was that there was an overuse of some forms of restrictive covenants in the labour market. And the research indicated that there are around 5 million employees and workers who were subject to non-compete restrictive covenants, and the typical duration of those was 6 months. And bearing in mind the non-competition covenant is the most onerous, it's the one that excludes you from the market and the environment in which your skills have the most value, you can see why it could have an effect on restricting labour and driving down competition. Now, back in 2020, the government's consultation looked at a range of different things. It looked at prohibiting certain types of restrictive covenants, it looked at capping the duration, and it looked at whether there was an obligation on employers to pay employees whilst they remain subject to restrictive covenants. And where they landed on was simply capping the maximum duration of the non-competition restrictive covenant, and they've capped that at 3 months. Now, there are a number of really important key takeaways. The first is that we don't know precisely when this legislation is to come into force. The government has said that they will introduce it when timetabling allows, but it's not clear when that is. Secondly, and this is absolutely critical, this proposal is only affecting the non-competition restrictive covenant. It doesn't affect the non-solicitation of customers, the non-dealing with customers, non-interference with suppliers, non-poaching of employees. Those provisions remain unaffected, and the law still stands that those covenants will be enforceable as long as you've got a reasonable business interest and that the way you've drafted it, so its extent and the duration, is also reasonable, and that can be for longer than 3 months. It's also absolutely critical to understand we're only talking about the non-competition restraint in the field of employment. So the government's proposal says, look, this is affecting employees and what they've called Lim B workers, so essentially those that provide personal service and are not genuinely self-employed. Now, the reason that's critical is you often see a non-competition restraint in things like a shareholders agreement, when they're arrangements between shareholders, or when you're buying and selling a business, and in things like partnership agreements. The question then becomes, what do employers need to do in response to the government's announcement? Should you change your approach to non-competition restraints and cap them at 3 months? I don't think you should do that, but I think there are 3 steps you should look at taking. Now, the reasons I don't think you should change your approach is we don't quite know when this is going to be introduced. So as an employer, you might as well seek the most protection you can for the longest period of time. So whilst they're not capped, don't concede the point that actually a limited period, so only 3 months, is what you should be seeking to protect your business. I think there's too much at stake if you just roll over and say, actually, we'll move instantly to a 3-month period. The other issues are that it's not quite clear how this law will be introduced. Will it have retrospective effect, or will it only be forward-looking? So will it only apply to new non-competition covenants introduced after the legislation comes into force? Or will it simply apply to every covenant regardless of when it will come in, when they came into force? And if it does have this retrospective effect, how does that work? Does it take a really sensible approach and say, look, if your non-competition covenant purports to stay in force for more than 3 months, so 3 months plus a day, that's automatically unenforceable, but otherwise it leaves it to be argued that the 3-month duration is okay? Or do they say that any covenant that is more than 3 months is void, and therefore you have to renegotiate that non-competition covenant with every person who's got a non-compete longer than 3 months? I hope it's the former, but that remains to be seen. We also need to really think about how we deal with the offset of garden leave, because typically you will automatically apply an offset for the duration of time someone spends on garden leave for the period of time the covenants remain in force post-employment. You might not want to do that. It depends on the way in which the legislation comes in. So do you take into account time on garden leave in the 3-month cap on a non-competition? I would argue you won't. But that just needs to be thought through. So that then brings on to the 3 key steps that you should think about taking. So step number 1 is to think about your notice periods. So this reform doesn't change that the easiest restrictive covenant to enforce is your garden leave. And garden leave is great because it achieves the same effect as a non-competition covenant, so it excludes someone from the market, but of course they're being paid, so it's more likely to be enforceable. But your duration of garden leave is capped by the period of notice. So if you've got someone at the moment with a 6-month non-compete and a 3-month notice period, if the 6-month non-compete might be shortened, why not think about extending the notice? Should you push it to 4 months? Does it give you a longer period of garden leave? So reviewing notice period is step number 1. Step number 2 is that if you cap the non-competition covenant at 3 months, it's going to mean the battleground for post-employment disputes moves away from the field of non-competition and looks at the other types of covenants. They'll become more prominent. Those things like the non-solicitation, the non-deal, the confidentiality provisions. Well, if the disputes may move, make sure your contracts are robust enough to cope with that. You may be relying on those alternative provisions a lot more than you do at the moment if you've got a reasonably drawn non-compete that lasts longer than 3 months. The final thing to do is, I always say restrictive covenants are a sticking plaster. They are preventing damage from caused by someone that has left. So they buy you a small window of protection. The best thing is to keep people from leaving in the first place. So that is looking at how you engage, motivate and reward employees all the way through. You want to make sure that either they want to stay, or if actually they're not that keen, they're financially motivated to stay through the way you structure your incentives. Perhaps tying them into some long-term retention, and that may well be particularly key if you've always used the deterrent of a longer non-compete to try and keep people loyal. Actually think about whether you need multi-year bonuses, look at various share efficient schemes, all of which tie you in for a longer period of time than perhaps your notice period. So those are 3 really sensible steps that I would advocate taking whilst you keep an eye on the government's timetabling and when and where it introduces the 3-month cap on non-competition restrictive covenants. Thanks very much and see you next time.